I'm Jenny Lawrence, a longtime member of the New York Society Library, which was founded in 1754. I find it astonishing that the library has closed its doors only 3 significant times in its history, during the American Revolution, briefly in a yellow fever outbreak in 1803, and during COVID's 3-month lockdown in 2020. We've come a long way in our 270 years, but we remain, as our founders envisioned the library, a society of readers, a society of bibliophiles that has not only endured but flourished. Our reference room and exhibition gallery are open to the public, but members have the additional benefits of access to our collection of 300,000 books in open stacks, and to our beautiful reading and writing spaces, and here in our members' room, which Caroline Alexander herself has described as the, quote, single room that exerts the greatest pull on me, a place where one can read and have the world fall away. You did say that. Tonight, it's a pleasure to welcome Caroline back to the members' room for a conversation with her editor, Wendy Wolf, about Skies of Thunder, the deadly World War II mission over the roof of the world, released today and available to buy right around you. Wendy Wolf got her start in publishing in 1975 as a secretary in the children's department at Knopf, moving eventually as a senior editor to Viking Books in 1994. She was vice president and associate publisher of the company when she retired in the December of this year. If you want recommendations for great nonfiction, you have only to go to her extraordinary roster of authors, among them Beverly Gage, Steven Pinker, Nathaniel Philbrick, Anita Hill, and Caroline Alexander, whose books with Wendy are The Bounty, The True Story of the Mutiny on the Bounty, The War That Killed Achilles, The True Story of the Iliad, and The Trojan War, and now Skies of Thunder, another true story. Caroline majored in classics at Florida State. She was in the first class of female Rhodes Scholars at Oxford, taking a degree in philosophy and theology. At the University of Malawi, between 1982 and 1985, she established a classics department, introducing the Iliad to her African students. At Columbia, Caroline wrote her dissertation on the Iliad. This was well before she published in 2009 The War That Killed Achilles and her own translation of the Iliad in 2015. In 1994, when Caroline was still living in New York and a library member, she proposed taking us through the Iliad, telling its story with Simon Preble, a truly bardic voice, reading selected passages. On those 2 nights in darkest January, the members' room was packed, hushed, as the 2 of them held us spellbound to a 3,000-year-old poem. The present world dropped away, the epic a greater reality. The same can be said for Caroline's books, The Endurance, The Bounty, The War That Killed Achilles, epics in different guises. We are now once again in the members' room, where the present world will drop away as Caroline and Wendy illuminate an extraordinary human endeavor during World War II, as Allied pilots flew supplies from Burma and India to China over the Hump through incredibly unpredictable and violent weather over a fearsome mountain range contiguous with one of the most remote jungles on Earth. The book includes astute portraits of the flawed players, including General Stilwell, Chiang Kai-shek, and Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers. It's a tale of death and destruction, but also of survival and courage. Like every one of Caroline's books, epic. Welcome to you both.
Would you like to sit here?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, for just stealing all my lines. Welcome to everybody. It's my great pleasure to be able to sit here and talk to Caroline. It's always a pleasure. We spend hours on the phone together. You would be amazed what we talk about. But tonight we're going to talk about Skies of Thunder and a part of World War II that you may know very little about, because I knew very little about it when we started. Caroline and I's relationship began with a book about a notorious episode in the 18th century on the sea. And the natural follow-up to that was, of course, a book on the Trojan War, which was naturally followed by a new translation of the Iliad. So the obvious next step would be taking you, into the jungles of Asia during World War II, right? Caroline, how did we get here?
Well, there was no clever route of scholarship or research that led to this, me wanting to do this story. I literally stumbled on it. Some years ago, in 2010 specifically, I was sent by National Geographic magazine to do a story about tigers. And one of the 3 locations I decided that I hit on covering was in northern Myanmar, in this remarkable, pristine, vast jungle ringed by mountains called the Hukong Valley. And it's now the site of the largest tiger reserve on Earth. And in this place, where very few people go, people who go are mostly the Kachin Independence Army, poachers or wildlife rangers. The wildlife officials were taking me round, and I was stunned to see in some of the very few small scattered villages these striking fences that surrounded vegetables plots. And the fences were made of jagged metal. And so I said, what is that from? And they said, oh, those are cut from the fuselages of the crashed cargo planes in the jungle. And so that was, first of all, striking information. And then one of the rangers described to me that in the course of his patrols, he had come across a downed cargo plane with the skeleton of a pilot still strapped into the left seat. So I left Myanmar with these very haunting images on the one hand, but also with sort of astounded that I had never heard of this theater, this place, these campaigns. And when I got back to the States and started doing some research, I found that there were an estimated, and a low estimate, by the way, some would say this is extremely low, close to just under 600 crashed cargo planes buried along in the jungle or smashed on mountainsides all along the route that they had flown, this route across the Hump. So I sort of circled this story for some time and dug into little bits and pieces of the research to see what was there. And that was, I think, the second revelation. There was so very much very good source material. There was, first of all, the Army Air Force files, which are tens of thousands of pages of documents, some completely mind-numbing, but have everything you need about the details, the grist, but also things such as accident reports, which are where every case study explains what an accident is, and if there's a survivor, the survivor writes it. So you had these series of narratives and so on and so forth. And finally, there were, or perhaps not finally, but there were also memoirs of the actual airmen. And these were either published by the pilots themselves or by their family after them, who had discovered that Dad had kept a diary. And amongst these, I wanted to say that one of them that was of the handful that particularly resonated was one by Robert Booty, whose family are here today. And this was a journal of a fighter pilot who had been essentially punished for going AWOL to see his fiancée, and he was punished by being sent to fly the transport plane. So this was a very eloquent indication of how that was thought. So between the novelty and the sources, but I think the final thing was that I felt that I had discovered something that is very unusual, which is an relatively unknown epic from World War II.
Which sounds like an inherent contradiction in terms, but I think it's very accurate that only people who have really dug into these theaters of war know anything. But the one thing they do know about, the thing that they hear about, the main character of the book, is the hump. So what I'd like to do is take us now into the book itself and into the theater of this war, and have you tell us a little bit about what the hump is geographically, and then what it is in the context, what part it plays in this epic story.
The hump is the main character, in a way, of this story. Very specifically, it refers to one ridge that between the Salween and the Mekong rivers. And this ridge rose to 15,000 feet and was the highest. This will sound very small, so bear with me. For us today who travel from here to Florida at 32,000 feet or something, this perhaps doesn't sound so very shocking. But so the highest of the peaks directly en route was this particular ridge called the Sansong Ridge, or Huangduang today on today's maps. And then there was another very high peak which marked where the route turned the corner, and that was 18,500 feet. So those were the sort of main peaks along the route. But the term, the hump, came to refer to the entire route, and then ultimately to the experience of flying the route. And we have to sort of conceptualize. It starts out, so the air supply, the purpose of this is to bring supplies to China. The nearest point of departure to China is northeast India. So there are scattered air bases in northeast India that have been mostly clawed out of the jungle or out of tea estates, much to the chagrin of the British tea planters. And then they fly in what looks on paper like a very clear, direct, nice route, and then with this turn to the southeast, and then they arrive in southwest China, in Yunnan province, southwest China, in Kunming. Along the route, when it was very first surveyed, when the very first scouting trip was made, on a very clear day with no weather, it was pointed out that if the weather were bad, this could be a very unforgiving route and possibly not even flyable.
I'm going to just interrupt for a second and explain ask you, they were flying without the following things: accurate maps, radar, oxygen, autopilot, radios, GPS. It was, this was like, head that way, avoid that mountain, and try to find the landing strip, which may or may not have been complete by the time you get there. That's the short version.
It was pointed out that to the north and the west of the course, this safe course over these known ranges, were mountains higher than they would be flying.
Right.
So the main point was you had to stick on this route. If you stuck on the route, all would be okay. So now we come to the second element, which is the weather. By a dreadful quirk of fate, this route just happened to bore through what would be regarded today as probably the worst weather system for aviation on the Earth, or above the Earth. And this was this convergence, this unholy convergence of these three systems that came from the Bay of Bengal On the one hand, the South China Sea to the east, and then sweeping down from Tibet and Siberia, the cold, dry air mass hitting these warm, moist air masses to create these chronically roiling, turbulent, ice-ridden masses of unstable air. And this also meant not just dangerous in the flying conditions, but lack of visibility. And when you're flying without GPS, and when you're flying with maps that actually were so inaccurate that they were essentially shelved aside at a very early stage, this meant that the pilots were flying blind. And there was only, at the very start of this operation, there was one point of reference off a radio beacon up in the northern part of Myanmar, or Burma as it was then. And after that, there was nothing along the 700 miles to Kunming. And one of the most eloquent stories, I think, is happened on a clear, perfect night when a chaplain had joined one of these transports. He said he felt that he wanted to share the experience of the airmen. So he did, bless his heart. And they fly out to China, they deliver their supplies, and then they're coming back. And it's a clear night, and he describes seeing the stars and the moonlight on the shining peaks far below, and he's dozing by the window, and then the plane goes on, and he looks at his watch, and he thinks we should be coming into India shortly. And another hour goes by, and then one of the co-pilot comes back and says, "Well, Padre, it seems we are plenty lost." And he snaps to he can't process what they're saying. And they're lost, and he says, "We've got about an hour more of fuel." And so the Padre thinks, well, in an hour they're going to figure that out. But they're over this vast jungle of Burma now, with no lights, with no reflection. And at the end of this, he's told, the crew chief comes back and says, "Let's get you fitted into your chute, Padre." And so he jumps, and he has this sort of wonderful description of jumping and falling through the kind of faint clouds and so on. But that's a bracing account because it was a placid night, and so gives you an idea of how difficult just direction finding was.
And I haven't even mentioned the headhunters that they find down on the ground.
The headhunters were very good allies.
They actually turned out to be heroes.
They were terrific. In fact, the safety of a bailing out airman almost always lay in the hands of the Naga, who were headhunters or had been, and the various other hill people who threw their lot in wholeheartedly and to great cost to themselves with the Allies. And the safety of airmen really depended. They were provided with these little flimsy safety kits like fishing hooks and mirrors to flash, signals and so on. But ultimately, safety lay in being discovered by a hill person.
So you have unspeakable terrain, horrible odds, nasty conditions at the best of times, risk out up the wazoo. Why is all this happening? Why are they making this trip? What's the underlying plot of this story?
You can dive in and cut me off because this is going to be, this is a very complicated, so the basic idea was,
first of all, what year are we in?
So we're starting in, the decisions in sort of, starts out around 1941.
Okay.
But with the Hump operation, the first flight is in April 1942, and then it goes all the way through the war, and in fact the last is flown slightly after the war. The inspiration was that the Roosevelt administration, and FDR specifically, who had family connections to China that he cherished and possibly overvalued, and believed that the fact that his maternal grandfather had made a fortune in opium and tea trading somehow made him an old China hand. But he felt a kind of interest and bond to China, and perhaps more concerningly, an insight into China. And we're talking in these days of China under Chiang Kai-shek. So when I say China, I should really be saying at every point nationalist China. Roosevelt looked over the horizon of this war and to the post-war world and envisioned what he saw as possible and desired when the dust settled. And that would be the European colonies shattered, which was already happening by 1942, and China stepping in to fill this power vacuum in the East. And that China would be a democratic, possibly Christian China, strongly allied to America. And they two together, China under American guidance and tutelage, would be one of the policemen of the world, and they would be this close alliance, and of course this was also great for trading and so forth. So he sent his economic advisor, Lachlan Curry, over to China to scout things out and come back and make one of the many interminable reports that were always coming back. And all the reports that came back from every level of American scrutiny reported that the nationalist government was not fighting the Japanese, that Chiang Kai-shek was a murderous fascist dictator,
Corrupt.
that the country was crumbling under him. But Curry even described not being able to speak openly with two individual Chinese nationals present because each would fear the other might turn on him. And so he came back with this sort of what one would think was a fairly damning report, but hope dawns ever eternal. And Lachlan Curry suggested, which very much accorded with Roosevelt's idea, that if we would, and this is an exact word, say nice things about China, it would go a long way to directing this country that was at a crossroads from veering away from a dictatorship to becoming a democracy. That if we gave tokens of friendship, that this would help encourage Chiang Kai-shek and so forth. So the whole origin of the Hump was really about making this symbolic gesture. It was not intended to nobody really believed these supplies would be used by the Chinese nationalists to fight the Japanese.
And they weren't.
And they weren't. In fact, many ended up on the black market or actually being traded to the Japanese.
So it was a kind of crass economic, political, diplomatic gesture, unfortunately betting wholly on the wrong team as who would lead China.
Betting on the wrong team, and then it gets complicated by the fact that two characters come into this narrative now. Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who is 59 years of age, and whenever one reads of him, you'll always read that he was sort of America's finest field general, fighting general. He had actually not been in combat until the first Burma campaign, which was when, after 2 months in the field, for no, by the way, fault of his own, along with the other allies, he was run out of Burma. And this constituted his entire military combat experience. So this hurt him, and it stung him, and he was a proud man, and if you will, had noble aspirations. He wanted to make a mark in history, wanted to have a campaign, and he starts gunning for a northern Burma campaign to rebuild the Burma Road, something that was utterly pointless and had been analyzed very closely by the British, and who said this road will never be completed in this war, and it's not, when it is, it's not going to carry very much. But anyway, this became an absolute passion that he swayed others to. So now we have a North Burma campaign that's a land campaign, and we need supplies for it. So the first diversion of the supplies over the Hunt will now go to this campaign. From the other side, you have Claire Lee Chenault, who's flying Tigers have been disbanded for some time, and he's reluctant to let go of that taste of being briefly a kind of general. He had been retired from the military for disability many years before. He had been deemed unfit to fly in a solo in any aircraft. But this was unknown in China, and he had become very close to Chiang Kai-shek. And so, as another gesture to China, the 14th Air Force is created under Brigadier General Claire Chennault, the only Air Force of the war, or possibly any war, that was created, according to the U.S. Air Force history itself, as for political reasons as opposed to military. So we now have this extraordinary situation where the Hump is to placate Chiang Kai-shek personally, but now the supplies are being fought over by these two competing and highly ambitious American generals. And so the end result is that at one point, at the time of China's greatest peril in the course of all of this, which is in the spring of 1944, when the Japanese just make this drive down from the north of the country and just wrap up all the air bases that have been put in place. At that point of greatest peril, Chiang Kai-shek is receiving 5% of all the tonnage that's carried over the Hump. The rest is going to these other, questionable campaigns.
I mean, I think the great irony of the how this history has been written until this moment is that the two names that people will know from this campaign are Chennault, because of the Flying Tigers, who flew for about 2 weeks, as far as I can gather, and Stilwell, as this great old, blood and leather American general. And yet they are what I would call the villains of the story. You're more humane to them. But I think what has gotten left out of this telling, and which is really the heart of your book, is who the true heroes are of this story. Who are the pilots? Who were the soul of the campaign, and whose eloquent words will break your heart as you read these books.
So the pilots are all the airmen suffer greatly, and that means the navigators who have to fly, and there's some very eloquent descriptions of feeling utterly impotent as they're just rocketed around these extraordinary flights. Is this a good time for me to?
This would be a good time.
Okay, I'm going to read an excerpt from
small readings. So
one of the bad flight stories, of which there's so many.
While she's looking at this, one of the people who was going along for the ride and got knocked down was Eric Severide, by the way, and he was he's written about this quite eloquently in his autobiography about the experience of being. How long were they down there for?
They were down. He jumped out. The whole aircraft of some 21, mostly civilians, who were being flown for a press junket on a clear day. Mm-hmm. And the engine of the plane, as they tended to, of these C-46 that were had been brought over, they were transports that had been rushed over to jump into the supply line, as it were, without being fully tested. Yeah. And so the bugs were worked out over the Hump, right. And with just cascading levels of fatalities and spectacular crashes. So this is just one. And I pick it because it's near the beginning, but there's so many of these hundreds and hundreds that would sort of give the same sense of the experience. This was a pilot who survived a bad flight. The cloud around us was as black as a dungeon cell. The air current seemed to grasp the plane and shake it as a dog would shake a rat, and then turn us loose, only to regain its grip and shake more violently than before. Snow and hail beat against the plane, and the vertical current seemed to be tossing us in a game of catch. The snow and freezing rain were forming huge slabs of ice on the leading edge of the wings. Cold sweat streamed down my face as I saw the small artificial horizon turn slowly on its side and stay there. Without it and my other instruments, I could not tell if the plane was diving, climbing, or rolling. Finally, as though we were bad taste in the mouth of the thunder god, The storm seemed to spit us out into the calm and soupy overcast. Minutes passed before anyone spoke. And that's a routine experience, this sense of many things happened. The ice would accumulate on the wings, which immediately compromised the plane's ability to fly. Ice would form on the propeller. Ice would clog the carburetors. The C-46 was such a fickle plane that engines, it was discovered, again, I quote the U.S. Air Force history because this means that I'm not putting any of my civilian sentiment into the story. This is in the words of the professionals, that the pilots tended not to trust it because of its tendency to blow up in flight, which I guess would
be unfortunate.
Cause you not to totally trust it. But so they would get into planes that they didn't trust, which is a dreadful feeling in and of itself. And the other part that's the flip side of, I don't know, courage is a very interesting thing. It's doing, I suppose, what's more than can be asked of you. And there were many pilots initially who were brought over to train who were very fine, very experienced pilots, and I actually spoke to one who alas died some years ago, but I interviewed him in his advanced 90s. He was absolutely crystal clear recollection. And he was clearly a very calm, very competent pilot. And he never described his fear. He described the bad experience. But I got the feeling that he'd always felt he could kind of handle it. But the majority of the pilots were not of that order. The majority of the cream of the classes, of the flight classes, had been skimmed off to go to the fighter pilots and bombers. And these were only transport. These are just flying transport. They're not combatants even. They're just like service of supply. And so there are extraordinary stories of these guys coming over, some of them with 25 hours of instrument training. I mean, that's something that if you went to a flight club today, you wouldn't be allowed to do much of anything with that little under your belt, on the one hand. And there was another pilot I interviewed who described going up to the C-46 for the first time, and he'd never seen one before. And they get in and with the co-pilot, and they read the manual while they taxi back and forth.
Here are the keys. Bring it back tonight.
So the pilots are collectively very young, very untrained, very cynical. They were very quickly aware of perhaps the futility of this exercise. They knew a lot of what they was carrying over was going to the black market, but doggedly they keep on going. I found one example, which I highlight in the book because it's very dramatic, of a court-martial for a pilot who refused to fly. But by and large, they get in and they do their job and they pull off this feat. And by the end of this operation, at the end of when they start, they strain to carry 1,000 tons a month over the hump. By the end of the campaign, they're flying 70,000 tons a month over the hump. It was the largest airline system in the world at that point. There were planes taking off every 5 minutes to fly to China.
And the paradox that we keep coming back to is that not only has it been forgotten and essentially rewritten out of history, but there's a comment that you made that they were able to do a number of remarkable experiments because there was so little at stake where they were going. And this is what we call the paradox of the Petri dish.
There's a period when the ground campaigns get up and going, which are too confused for me to go into here. But suffice to say, there was the Japanese invaded India with intention of marching to Delhi on the one hand, and they had to be held back by the British Indian Army. And then on the other side is this North Burma campaign under General Stilwell to build the new Burma Road or the Lido Road. And within this this ground campaign, Henry Arnold, Hap Arnold, the chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, who can be credited with essentially building the Air Force during this period of war, realized that there was in Burma, not the Indian campaign, but in Burma, there was actually very little at stake. It really didn't matter that much if the Lido Railroad was built or not. It wasn't going to defeat the Japanese if it was or if it wasn't, and that therefore this was a wonderful opportunity for experimentation. And so he gives the Special Forces officer an absolute madman, and I mean that quite literally, Order Wingate, a remarkable character who pops up at all points of history in different places and pops up here as the mastermind of the British Chindits, which was the special guerrilla forces. And he gives him this array of air power, cargo transport planes, 200 gliders, 6 helicopters. In this theater is the first evacuation by a helicopter in military history. Light planes to do these medical evacuations. And he essentially says, go to it, to his trust. He said, I want everything that a innovative, bright airman can think of. And so in this kind of weird backwater Petri dish, actually emerge honed techniques for things that will be carried forward into the inevitable sequence of wars that will follow.
Including jungle fighting?
Jungle fighting, helicopter evacuations, medical evacuations on absolutely improvised airstrips, but also the whole change in the way armies march, because it was discovered, it had not been thought of before, that you could supply an entire military campaign by air. So the line of communication stretching through the jungle is no longer required. You can make these airdrops. And that changes tactics, it changed the ability, it blunted the Japanese tendency to try and surround their enemy, because if you had an airfield at your back, it didn't matter if you were surrounded. If you had that airfield at your back, you could be supplied with men and with materiel and with food and anything you needed. And so things started to change. And of course, out of it, ultimately, emerged very unglamorously, if you will, but the ability to move vast amounts of men and supplies around. And we see General William Tunner, who oversaw the last and perhaps most productive period of the Hump operation, goes on to be the commander of the Berlin airlift shortly after the war. And then, of course, these same tactics were used in Korea, or same knowledge was used in Korea.
So there are some victories in it. There are some achievements. There is political upset, because we haven't even brought in Churchill, which would take another hour of how pissed off he was at the whole operation. Do you think that the murky politics are the reason it's essentially been left out of the story of the war? Because when you think of the Japanese theater, you think of the Pacific. You don't think of a land war. Or you think, oh, that's something that happened with the China Civil War. Or wasn't that got to do with India and the fight for freedom? And the whole bit in the middle has just been left out. I mean, why did it get left out?
I think it was a sheepishness, for one thing.
Right.
It had been, during the war, there was a huge media campaign, very determined to make heroes, for example, of Stilwell and of Chenault.
And Merrill's Marauders. You know,
and Marauders, we say, they were heroes.
They were heroes.
But they also eventually mutinied and threatened to assassinate Stilwell, which got sort of left edited out, and wrote angry articles to local newspapers that we don't read anymore. So I think one was that, and by the way, the inflation of some of these characters, it's easy to be cynical about that, but I think in time of war, there was some of it was just the idea that you boost morale at home.
Right.
You highlight heroes and you showcase them, and morale is very important. So it's easy to be overly cynical of that. It wasn't necessarily sinister, but I think that nonetheless it was therefore just jarring to sort of have had this media campaign which promoted certain key figures on the one hand, and then the vast media campaign that was overseen by Henry Luce of the Time Life Empire and March of Time newsreels. He was the son of American missionaries to China, and he believed literally that it was God's desire that, and divinely appointed, that America and China should be sort of allies going forward. And so he made, I think Chiang Kai-shek appeared on the cover of Time something like 8 times in the course of the war, more than any other leader. And so the image that was given to Americans was that here was this fighting general, this noble cause, these great heroes, and then suddenly,
Whoops.
it's sort of poof, it's gone. And I think it was just sort of a kind of let's get on to the next chapter and not drag that all around. And how are we possibly going to explain the muddle of this? I should say, and maybe this is a good towards the end note, the China-Burma India Theatre, its acronym is obviously CBI. And very early in the campaign, this was adopted by airmen to mean confusion beyond imagination.
Well, everything about it was confusing, I can tell you. But it was much less confusing. And I think Caroline, I mean, we've worked closely together for a long time, but I've never seen someone bring such clarity and perspective and reinvent it with importance as you have to this unbelievable story that only today was dubbed officially riveting by the New York Times Book Review. So I send you all to that review. We have some time for questions if anybody has any from the audience or comments. Sir?
How much of this supply was to help the British fight the Japanese in Burma?
None. I mean, there was a different operation to supply the Chindits and the Marauders and the whole North Burma campaign. So the British in Burma, as opposed to British in India, really were the 20,000 Chindits and then the 3,000 Marauders. The Marauders and the Chindits were special operations, jungle-trained groups. They were meant to work together, but Stilwell hated the British so much, he refused to have the Americans work with the British. But essentially they were doing, they were trained in the same way, and they had, the Marauders were badly used by Stilwell to become kind of assault troops, which they weren't trained for. But the Chindits were there to run interference for Stilwell with the Chinese, with the Japanese, to make sure that there were no more, that their lines of communication would be disturbed and so on and so forth. They were supplied by air drops, which were not being flown over the Hump, but were flown by people like Robert Boody, the pilot that I referred to at the beginning, who he calls his book Food Bomber Pilot. Because that's what he ended up doing, was dropping the supplies, which became a great art because, the jungle was featureless. And so one of the other things that was devised actually was how you coordinate with the aircraft to make sure that you have these precision drops.
There's a question, Jenny?
Oh, I wondered about Padre. We just left him in a parachute.
Padre survived to write his memoir, which is called 5 Miles Closer to Heaven.
Padre to the core. Over here.
I'd like to know what they were carrying over the hump. What were
Okay. were mostly, and that's actually a very good question, I should because it adds, first of all, to the heightened fear of the pilots. What would be the scariest thing you could hold in an aircraft, in an unstable aircraft? We have a pilot in the audience. Do you want to say what it is?
Aviation gas.
Aviation gas.
In leaky barrels.
In leaky barrels. So aviation gas is the scariest thing you could hold, and that's mostly what they hold. However, they also hold printed paper money, Chinese money, nationalist Chinese money that was printed in, I think it was Philadelphia, and then brought in massive tons to help try and fight inflation, though I've never quite worked out how that would have worked. They brought, some of the bombers ended up carrying their own fuel across the hump in order to stage for what were supposed to have been bombing runs. But the classic thing, and I do not know, I think the story is true, but elements of it may be apocryphal, but I will tell it nonetheless because it was told by almost all the pilots. Allegedly, Madame Chiang Kai-shek's Steinway piano was flown over the hump for her to enjoy using in eventually in Chongqing. And the story goes, it's told by a number of different points of view and airmen, that the plane was what the crews, the air crews had got quite used to jettisoning supplies when things went wrong. So if there was ice on the wings and the plane was just sinking, they would lighten the plane by jettisoning supplies. Similarly, if the engine cut off. So this was something that had become a fairly standard feature. And the story goes that they were flying along straight and level and stable air, and that they kind of looked at this piano and thought, you know what? Why are we flying Madame Chiang Kai-shek's piano to China? And then the pilot said, whoops, looks like we've got some turbulence here. And so the cargo door was opened and the piano was tossed out. And somewhere in the, I was trying to work out what would survive from a piano in the jungles of Burma. It would be the Ivory Keys, presumably.
That's what's known as a fact too good to check.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Right.
Yeah, I read there was a major biography at Stillwell, which I suffered through. And that caused me to go to Burma 6 years ago. You know, it's so sad there, you know, what happened to this country. Because Burma was as important as China and India. And now it's, you know, quite tragic.
Nothing worked out as as any of the participants, I think, had planned. So, and yes.
In the far back?
Yeah. Is it to imply that Stillwell he was maligned, but he was really a hero, and that Chiang Kai-shek was nothing but a thug, a thief? Now, it seems to me that much of what I've read and heard about Stillwell is not quite the way it's being presented here. And also, Chiang Kai-shek's character is not exactly the way it's being presented here. There's many people who thought Stillwell was a lot worse than he's been portrayed, and that Chiang Kai-shek had a lot of problems that perhaps people who tear him down don't quite understand. I mean, his country was invaded by Japan. He was trying to hold together for the United States and himself this country because the United States was egging him on. I'm not quite sure that I agree with everything you said. I've discussed this at length with my brother-in-law, who's been translating Chiang Kai-shek's 55 years of diaries.
which were used in some of the good histories that I used. I think that one of the things I would say is that this whole story, for those who even know it, and I think you referred to a biography of Stilwell, I'm guessing it was Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China. I was referring to the lady here who mentioned the biography. I think one of the ways that this historical subject has suffered is that it has drawn black and white dichotomies between the key players. Either Chiang Kai-shek was right or Stilwell was right. If one was right, the other was wrong. If Chenault, there was a huge rivalry between Stilwell and Chenault, and again, it's fallen into the camp. It's one or the other is right, and that means the other is wrong. And this has tended to draw these kind of very harsh fault lines between the characters. But I think that one of the advantages of going to source material with fresh eyes is that you allow the cards to fall where they're going to fall from the, I think one of the advantages that I would say that I might have had coming into the subject is that I had no preconception. I think it was an advantage that I was not coming at it from another aspect of either Burma, history of China, US Air Force history, and carrying any kind of luggage with I came. I can only say that when the source material is read, which I hope you will do when you read the book, and I'm very happy to correspond with you afterwards, you might have a different view. But the analysis of Chiang Kai-shek was, I would say that he was a patriot. I would say that he hated the Japanese for all the right reasons for what they were doing to his country. I think he had a inscrutable kind of courage. It is not true, however, that his country could have survived him.
And I think we cannot give a full sense of the incredible detail and nuance of the story in the 20 minutes that we have to talk about it, but I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about after you've read it.
There's endlessly more to talk about.
We have time for one more question. Anybody? In the far back.
What was the human cost?
That's for the hump specifically. It's estimated that, and again, the estimates vary so much that this it in itself tells you that this is a suspicious figure. But it's estimated that 1,700 to 3,200, 300 airmen died as a result of just flying the hump. Now, first of all, again, it's important to remember these are non-combatants, and very few of these casualties had anything to do with enemy action. So this is just a testimony to the sort of inherent danger of carrying the supplies. But the other point of interest is that records were really not kept for the first year or so of the war, and it's even the estimate of how many people bailed out isn't securely known. I think it's estimated about 1,200 men, but there's reason to think that those are probably understated rather than overstated.
I have a question.
We have one last.
Yeah. Caroline, I may be so off things. Was the Chinese Air Force a part of this? Because my father-in-law was part of one of things or no, I'm off base.
Is this the Chinese National Aviation Corps? Yes, absolutely. This is the famous CNAC or CNAC, who were really were the first, when the route was surveyed, it was done by CNAC pilots and by the chief of operations, because they had been flying commercial flights around the area before and then later during the war. And they were so efficient that there was a period when it was suggested that maybe this it was the Chinese National Aviation Corporation was 50% owned by Pan American Airways, 50% owned by a Chinese national government, and had both Chinese and American pilots under mostly American management. But it was suggested that they might run the whole operation because they were doing a better job than the US Army Air Forces, and then that was thought to be inappropriate. I should end by saying that one of the most remarkable sort of small facts that came out of it is that the one of the pilots for CNAC that flew on did one of the last civilian evacuations as Burma fell. There's this tremendous, we didn't even get into that, but this extraordinary exodus of people, everybody essentially who's not a Burman, trying to flee the country. And they get stuck up at Michinaw, with the furthest northern air base, and are being evacuated. And the pilot who comes in, pilot Chin Moon, veteran pilot, I was pleased to see lived to 106 years of age and has died a very short while ago.
And on that pleasant note. Thank you.
Thank you.